Perhaps it was your grandmother, or maybe a next-door neighbor, or possibly someone you've never met, but whose story you've heard. Our lives are shaped by those we meet along the way. This is a collection of stories from people in our lives who exemplify community, civility, and compassion. This is the Community Memory Project.
One famous writer said, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pitchers of silver." Hello, my name is Judy Knowles. I moved to Delphi in 1989 and soon discovered this library, which is no surprise because I have always appreciated the artists who are able to bring the treasure inside and get it down on the printed page. I had this book of poetry called 101 Famous Poems. My parents read it to me before I could even read. And I probably, as a child, I liked it because every writer is pictured on each page of poetry. So that was interesting to me. One famous writer around here that everybody has heard of, is familiar with, is James Whitcomb Riley. And he was around Delphi in the probably 1880, 1884, around that time. And he wrote On the Banks of Deer Creek, which I just love. Because my husband was a fisherman and he fished on the banks of Deer Creek, and I love this writer, so it just means a lot to me. For the past 30 years, I have been writing poetry and only recently tried my hand at short stories. This library has been instrumental in providing me with the research I needed. I couldn't have done it without the kindness shown to me when I needed just a little more information. This prompted me to write an essay of appreciation. Among the pleasures afforded us in this life, there are catching the biggest fish in the pond, hot fudge sundaes, falling in love, an autumn sunset, a family vacation, and a visit to your local library. We, the locals of Delphi, are most fortunate. Our 3-story brick galleria is filled with a parade of pages, a pageantry of film, a pandemonium of adventures for children, a convoy of community conclaves. This assembly gives us that much-needed comfort, like a warm blanket on a cold night, the constant in a world of change. Is it the friendly smile, the helping hand, the highway of knowledge to explore? Yes, it's that and so much more. Between certain covers, I have toured the balconies of Barcelona, the pavilions of Paris, the rooftops of Rome, and the latitudes of London. I've milked cows with the Amish, baked pies with Betty Crocker, and seen the caribou of Alaska. Yes, it's all this and so much more. It's acceptance. When you come to the library, you're coming to visit friends, and they make you feel welcome. You know, looking around the library, you would think the last thing the world needs is another writer. And yet, so many of us continue to write because we have caught the vision like a sail catches the wind. We sail on, not because it is needed, but because we have to. In closing, let me leave you with this thought. May I take this day to bring harmony into someone's life.
I remember growing up, I grew up in a Catholic family, and we went to church every Sunday, and I remember going to Sunday school as well, and so I grew up around the sort of being absorbed in a culture of stories about compassion, the stories of Jesus of Nazareth touching lepers and the self-sacrifice that he experienced, that he showed, putting himself at risk while showing compassion to someone who was suffering, was very impacting to me. So as I heard those stories in church and knew that they were put before us as the way that we were being challenged to live, so I watched the people around me and whether they were living those stories out or not. And I watched my mother and father live compassion towards us as a family, but also towards those that we interacted with. And one of the ways that they played that out in their lives was they were foster parents for children who needed care. They already had 4 or 5 children at the time, and so to take in other foster children was an impressive example to me of trying to live that out. I began to really fall in love with those who did that, showed compassion in a real, radical way, in a way that was very beautiful. So Mother Teresa was one of my biggest role models growing up, and I remember feeling called to be a nun probably because of her example, and always thought that that was probably one of the most beautiful ways that I can imagine living. One of the things I was thinking about is where else have I heard, where else was I encouraged to be compassionate, from what other sources besides the Bible? And the one thing that came to mind was a book I read when I was a little girl. I always loved nonfiction better than fiction, and this story was called Turning the World Upside Down, and it was the true biography of Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were women who grew up in the South and were of a wealthy planting family, and they decided to speak out against slavery and speak for women's rights, and they were kind of ostracized from their Quaker community because of it, and lost a lot of friends and a lot of respect in some quarters, but became really powerful voices against slavery. And that book, I'll never forget it. It was a red cover with white white lettering, and it had such an impact on me. I probably read it multiple times. And again, it was so inspiring to me that they had compassion even in a society and in a surroundings that didn't encourage it. Their surroundings encouraged them to stay quiet and not do anything about it, and yet they had the courage to speak up and made a powerful difference for so many people. Another thing that strikes me as little but with a big impact is when my father died a couple of years ago, people from Delphi, who were friends of mine from church, came to the funeral and were there to support me. And I'll never forget a couple who are very dear friends who came to the grave site. It was blustery cold. It was January 1st, or January, it was probably the second week in January. And they came to the gravesite ceremony, and just stood. They weren't under the tent or under the covering at all, because probably there were too many of us family members filling that space. But they stood off to the side in the cold and just stood there to stand with me. And I get teary thinking about it because it was a really powerful show of compassion, and it seems like compassion is to suffer with, and so in that sense they were suffering with me and showing me that they were by my side when I needed them. So that was a little thing, a very little thing, but a very powerful impact.
I'm Gail Hildreth, and I was asked to participate in this project, and I was interested in the part of the project that dealt with people who influenced your life with respect to the Golden Rule. I thought of my mother because she often did that. There were often lessons things that she would say to me that indicated that the Golden Rule was important to her. And the most memorable of those would have been a time we were visiting a relative, and the TV was on. We didn't have TV at that time, I think, and so I was pretty interested in watching it, and a black man came on the TV screen, and my relative said, "Oh, there's a big thundercloud." And my mother turned to him and said, "Do you think if we removed the skin from that black man and a white man that you could tell the difference between them?" And he just sort of said, "No." And that's all she said. But it was enough for me to remember the rest of my life. Just to give you an aspect of my mother's personality, she talked to me quite a few times about not smoking because it was bad for your health. And I, being a typical kid, didn't pay attention to it. I thought it would still be neat to try it anyway. I'd heard from my friends that if you could smoke corn silks. So we cribbed ear corn, and those ears would often have old silks clinging to them. So I made a corncob pipe, and I went out one afternoon in the corn crib and stuffed that pipe full of silks and proceeded to smoke it, which was a bad experience because it tasted terrible. I didn't think anyone had seen me, and a few days later my mother asked me, she said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "I'm fine." I said, "Why are you asking me?" She said, "Well, I just wondered after seeing you smoke that corncob pipe, the silks in that pipe," she said, "I wondered if you were concerned about getting corn borer fever." And I didn't say very much about it, and I stewed about it for several days until finally she came to me and she laughed about it. She said, "There's nothing like corn borer fever." But I think it was a lesson in the fact that she knew what was going on.
But honestly, there are two questions. One, when people say, well, why did you write it? Did you write it to help relieve the grief? No, that didn't do it. But I did feel that there were many things that we experienced that would help others, that people may not have known, that would encourage others, and just by knowing those things that maybe somebody else would be helped. I also wrote it because sometimes when somebody like Tom is taken, you say, well, was God just mad at Carroll County that day? What happened? And I think when you get the whole story, I think there's a lot of people needed to see that, no, God wasn't mad at Carroll County. His timing's perfect, and He has a plan, and He has a purpose. So that was kind of one of the other reasons that I wrote it. I will read a small section of the time that Tom was in the Jesus People, and I think probably a lot of you have read the book. I won't spoil it by reading this part. Hi, Marion Lee. But yes, he was in the Jesus People. And another thing people have said to me is all that true? Yes, it is. And Tom's time in the Jesus People, I think, caught both his experience and part of the American culture of the 60s and 70s, because it was a widespread experience. Most students had relatively little money in the late 70s and 80s. They were not as rich as they are today, when we didn't have credit cards. Tom and I were no different, but Tom had known poverty and hunger in a way that neither I nor most other students could even imagine. After Tom became a Christian, he wanted to become involved in full-time ministry. With only the money in his pocket and the clothes he could fit into a knapsack, he joined the Jesus People. During the 60s and the 70s, the Jesus People traveled across the country, living in tents that were carried from town to town by a caravan of semi-trailers, preaching the gospel to everyone who would listen. Tom made two very good friends while traveling with the Jesus People, Tobias and Zoe. Tobias had been a practicing transvestite before becoming a Christian. Zoe had been a practicing witch. It was late. A frigid November wind plucked at the backs of the three gospel messengers. Huddled together for warmth, they stumbled down the street toward a late-night diner. They pushed the door open and scooted into a warm booth. Tom, Zoe, and Tobias had handed out tracts and led the singing during the presentation of the gospel at the evening's tent meeting. But they were reluctant to return to their frigid sleeping bags on the cold, hard floor of the tents. "Anybody got any money?" Tobias asked. His shoulders were still hunched from the cold. Zoe rubbed her hands together and replied, "Yeah, right. You know we all have to turn our money over to the big guys. I don't have 2 nickels to rub together." "She's coming over to our table." Tom pointed at the baggy-eyed waitress, whose shoulders slouched with an exhaustion that weighed down her smile as well as her shuffling feet. "What do you kids want?" she exhaled as she asked. Zoe and Tobias looked at Tom. Zoe shrugged. Tobias opened his mouth to speak, but Tom quickly interjected. 3 cups of hot water, please." "Figures," she sighed as she pivoted away. As soon as she set the steaming cups of hot water on their table, Tom grabbed the ketchup bottle. Squeezing a sizable help into the cup of water, he passed the bottle to Tobias. Then he stirred his watery gruel. "Look, guys, this is how you make tomato soup." On one of those frosty nights, Tom found a drunken man stretched across the sidewalk grate. Bending down, he shook the man by the shoulders. "You've got to get up, sir. Listen, you'll get frostbite. You need to come with me." The elderly man rolled over and sat up as if in a dream. "I have no place to go," he slurred. Yes, you do," Tom told him as he pulled the man to his feet and helped him stand. Pulling the man's arm around his shoulders and reaching his other arm around the man's waist, Tom guided him back to the tent. Once there, he gently laid the man in his sleeping bag, tucked him in, and zipped it up. Tom slept on the ground that night, shivering until the morning sun wrapped its warmth around his cold, stiff shoulders. When he awoke, the man was gone. Several days later, Tom began to scratch his scalp incessantly. He was crawling with lice. He washed his hair with kerosene and turned his sleeping bag inside out after a good delousing. Did he regret sharing his sleeping bag with a man who left no other thank you than an infestation of lice? No, Tom always said. I think that is what Jesus would have done. And I thought that part kind of summed up the way Tom did a lot of things.
Born in 1940, and from the time I was about this high, I had a champion. And that champion was a man who has a profound effect on me and also had quite a profound effect on the community. The man's name was James French. He was most revered as an excellent teacher. He had such a background working with children. And that's the part that I want to tell about, how his impact in Delphi and how much that means to our community today. Jim retired in 1987 or so. And within about a year after he retired, he came back to Delphi and lived just out south of Delphi a little ways, and became very interested in our community again, because he had more or less grown up here, at least his latter high school days were here. So he joined the Canal Board and quickly became president, because I think you're always looking for good leadership and certainly someone to take that spot. So for 10 years, from 1988 to 1998, he was president of our Canal Association. Well, now that period of time, 1988 to 1998, was a very interesting era for our Canal Association. First of all, we had no money. Had a willing group, a small group of volunteers as directors that were out there to try to make an impact and to try to put some things together in the community. But at the same time, there was Jim, who could see that we really weren't reaching the people yet, because these attitudes in Delphi that had said, you'll never make anything out of it, how are you going to raise money, how are you going to make an impact in your community. So Jim's attitude was, let's start with something that we can accomplish and show off quickly or reasonably to the community in a positive way. Since he knew better than anyone I've ever known in my life how to get children involved, how to get them motivated, how to get them disciplined, how to get them to take part, how to get them to have pride and a passion in something that they're doing. So his attitude was, let's get kids involved and let's find some things they can do, and that was trails. And to this day, our Delphi Historic Trail System started in 1988. And this was a period of time when I was just coming back to Delphi. I came back in 1987. So he put me in charge of the trails, and his leadership was profound. He had such a soft touch towards children that we would go out and we would get children on maybe even a monthly basis, at least during the better weather. We had what we called third Saturday work days. Well, in this case, if it was too cold or too hot, you don't work in January or maybe even July or whatever. But we had a regular rapport with these kids, and it got also involved with their parents as well. Now, some of these same parents could very well be the ones who had also said, don't ever try to do this because it's too big a job and you're never going to make anything out of it. But certainly grandparents and others had been taught by their previous generation to not love the canal because, after all, most people said, that's terrible down there. There's rats and snakes and dirty water and mosquitoes that will carry away in the summertime, and all the reasons why this is not a very savory place. After all, mothers knew this was not good for their kids to be in that kind of an environment. But when you take an area and you start to clean it up, and you start making it look like something, take a trail and just pick up the sticks and make a rudimentary path down through between the trees and begin to develop it. And then what happens is the kids go home that night after they've had a Saturday work day, and they say, hey Mom, hey Dad, hey Grandma, let's go out and look. I got to show you what we did. Well, how are these people going to be negative when it's a positive story and they're involved? Their children are involved, grandchildren. And so Jim became the master at how to get kids to turn the community around, which is the essence of better than any other way you could do it. You couldn't buy that kind of akin to the community. You were actually thwarted otherwise because of the negative attitudes that had been out there. But the kids went right on through that. So Jim then was our president clear through till 1998 for, I call it 10 years, or use the word tenure. You know, he was an educator, so tenure. And Jim made such a change in our community in that period of time that we went from being the scorned community development group out here that was never going to make it and could never find that kind of money to one that saw it as an opportunity.
My mother grew up in St. Joe County, South Bend and North Liberty. She went to high school in North Liberty, graduated from there, went to IU and became a teacher, and then got married and raised a family and went back to teaching. Tolerance is an aspect of compassion, I think, that I picked up from my mother at an early age. And my father was quite tolerant as well. I think her father was especially important in developing her values. My mother started doing community organizing in the sense of really working with the community after she retired from teaching, and she looked about. She was still rather young and not quite 60, and she looked about for something to do and saw that the old canal was a historic resource that nobody was paying any attention to. And she just sort of took it upon herself to organize and get people who are interested. Bob Bradshaw, for instance, who is a historian and a local history teacher, as well as a number of other local leaders. They formed the first Canal Association in around 1970. I wasn't living around here at the time, and so I don't quite know some of those stories, but certainly she was the main founder of it. She would not say that. She's very modest, and she would have pointed to other people as having done the work and so forth. As far as a kid growing up, I guess what I appreciated a lot was her, and she would do this with all the children that she had in school, praise them for their abilities. She would talk about how there was always something that the kid was good at, and she would foster that with the child, and certainly that was my case. I can remember she would allow us to have this natural history museum, and we would bring in all kinds of things, and we had a sort of an extra room, a sunroom in the house, and birds' nests and birds' eggs and various animal carcasses and feathers and all sorts of things. And of course, as a kid, oh yeah, well you just do that sort of thing, you know. But I don't think there would be as many mothers as her that would allow for you to take up a a whole room with that kind of exhibit. Of course, we couldn't keep the exhibit forever, but it was like we would have these, quote, special exhibits that would last for a week or two, and with all our collections.
Compassion, civility, tolerance. Through listening to the stories of our past, we learn how these traits and the extraordinary individuals who exhibited them came together to build a loving and diverse community. With these memories and stories in mind, we look to celebrate the past and continue improving our community in the future.